Hello everybody, Brayden here, and welcome to the third game of the 2017 Guelph Under 1700 tournament, I guess. So I am now playing against someone much stronger than myself. Well, I was underrated, I guess, in the first two games as well. Not underrated as in my play. My play wasn't perfect, but I have been lower rated than all of my opponents thus far. And now it is the final game of this day. This was a two-day event, and there was 3 games the first day, 2 the next. So it was, end of a long day, and I had a strong opponent. You can see where this might be going, but okay, I don't want to make excuses. They deserve this one. Just a bit of a hint there. So they played d4. I played d5. Knight f3. Knight c6, going for the same thing that I've gone for before, thinking that I'm putting pressure on this d4 pawn, even though that's not really quite the case. They played bishop to f4 now, going for a London system. And as some of you may know, normally against the London, you want to be able to break with c5. That's one of the most challenging ways to play. But after knight c6, you can't move your c-pawn, which is the big downfall of the opening. So bishop to f4 was played, and of course, we wish that c5 could be played as a response, but it cannot. Now we see knight to f6 from me. e3, a6 to prevent bishop to b5, bishop to d3, bishop g4, knight b d2, e6, h3, and bishop to f5 for some reason. I think retreating the bishop to h5 feels a little bit better. The idea of bishop to f5 is interesting. The whole point is after takes, we're trying to control more of the e4 square. However, it's not quite the best move here, just because, well, we can actually see some sort of c4 popping up, where this d-pawn might become something that's of a huge annoyance against black in the center. But of course, this wasn't played in the game. Instead, they played knight to e5 here, which I think is quite interesting. Preferably, I think bishop takes f5 is something I would play if I were playing white here. Knight to e5 is also an interesting move, going for a ton of activity here. I ended up taking on e5 here, and after d takes e5, what I probably should have done is take on d3. And the reason why is because of what we'll see kind of in the game. I think there was better responses by me in some parts, but I think taking on d3 is the preferred move, where if, for example, they were to take on f6, we can retreat our bishop, for example, to g6. And even though we trade off these pawns, if we were to castle short, we are pretty safe here. I think actually castling long might even just be better. But we do have the bishop pair, and even though it's equal material, black does have a lot of central control and probably is much better in this position because of it. Instead, I played the move knight to d7, allowing bishop takes f5, e takes f5, and now knight to f3. And here, the position's quite uncomfortable actually, because, well, when we look at it, these doubled pawns fall by this pawn on e5. We can see that this pawn creates quite a nuisance in our position. It controls a lot of dark squares, for example, f6 and d6, the only two it does cover. And there's a specific move that they can play later on, which can give us a big headache, and we'll actually see that in the game. So knight to b6 was played. I think this is fine. I think maybe we don't want to put the knight in front of the b pawn either, because maybe we would want to advance in the future. So something like knight to c5 or the move c6 I think are going to be preferred here. Knight to c5 is the more important one because of what happened in the game. But again, we're going to get to that in just a moment. I played knight to b6, so okay. Now we see c3, and this is partly just to control the d4 square a little bit more, to prevent us from going for example, like a c5 to d4 break, to try to take things off of the center and maybe liquidate things, where white does have an edge because of this e5 pawn, which is, again, quite annoying. I played the move g6, and now things get pretty uncomfortable for me. And the big reason why is because I'm weakening my dark squares where they have a lot of dark square control in my camp. As you can see, again, f6 and d6 are covered by this pawn, and now f6 is even weaker because I'm not controlling it. My opponent had a really cool idea here with a move we'll see in just a moment. However, for example, I think a move like queen to d4 is apparently quite interesting, and this is what the engine suggests. I prefer my opponent's move more because of what we'll see. The whole point is, for example, if c5, which looks like we're just getting that move in with tempo. The whole point is after queen d3. Now these pawns are actually just extremely weak, and after, for example, some sort of like rook d1, even b3 and c4, these pawns are actually just going to get like knocked down, and they can be treated like a hanging pawn structure. So that's a very interesting idea from the computer of provoking c5 to say that the d5 pawn is now weaker because of it. Yeah, so they played e6 instead, and I think this is actually really interesting. And I think it also highlights that I probably should have developed my bishop, for example, to e7 here, and then castled. G6 is technically inaccurate, but for very specific reasons. So after e6, f takes e6, and queen to d4, which was played, rook g8 also played, and now knight to g5. After bishop g7 and queen c5, everything looks like we're kind of holding on here. But we have to just give up the c7 pawn and understand that we actually have a ton of compensation in terms of we have more central control. Maybe compensation is the wrong word, because we do have equal material in this position. So after the move, again, king to d7, queen takes e7, king takes, and bishop takes on c7 here. We do have, again, for example, knight c4, and this is very, very, very specific. This is something that maybe if I was a stronger player I would have seen, maybe not, but understanding that it will be equal material at the end of the day, black can now follow up with a move like h6, and again, all of these pawns are, you know, controlling a lot of the center, and I think that black has a reasonable suspicion or reasonable expectation to be better here. I'm not sure exactly the words I should say here, but the more you look at it, the more clear it is that black has a better position here after they defend the b pawn with something like rook to b1. So anyways, going back to it, queen c5 was played, and I didn't know how to deal with this because I was losing the extra pawn I was up, and this is quite annoying because all of their pieces are extremely active. Seeing a move like queen e7 is possible, but it's not necessarily a move you want to make, right? So I played e5 because I thought this was winning a piece. However, it's not, because they do have a response here. So for example, if they moved away, let's just say bishop to g3. Now, yeah, I can take on g5 here. Computer actually prefers bishop f8, which is pretty funny. But I can take on g5, and after takes on c7, just play something safe, like knight to d7 here. And we're just up a full piece, and there's not really enough compensation at all for it, and black should be winning this game. But of course, after e5, there's the move knight e6, which pops up. And funnily enough, there's a lot of annoying threats here. Knight takes c7 is a primary one, so that's why I played the move I did in the game. And, well, the queen's being attacked. And although this bishop is hanging right now, it doesn't matter because my queen's attacked, and I have to deal with that first. Knight a4 shows up by the engine for some reason, and there's a good reason why. Of course, it's because there's a knight takes c5 threat at the end of the day. Of course, I did not see that because I'm like 1300 in this game. So I played queen e7, and after queen e7, the whole point is if they take on c7, they can't take on a8 immediately. However, this is losing now. So knight takes c7, king f7, queen takes, king takes, and bishop to g5 check. And I played bishop f6 in this position, and after bishop takes, king takes, and knight takes a8, the game's just over by this point. They were just able to get a ton of initiative because I just wasted time and didn't get my king to safety. And because of that, I lost material and will lose the game. So there were some important parts as we saw before. Let's continue on though, and I'll just show the final moves. Rook takes, long castles, king e6, g4, f4, takes to open up more files against my king. They gave me a check. King back to f6, h4, and now h5, where after g5 check king f5, they played f3, which I think is a really good technique because if they don't play that and they play something else, then they're allowing king g4, king takes h4 stuff. Of course, this is losing no matter what, but f3 is just a really nice, like, you can't do anything, and you're just going to suffer type of move. And, well, they were right. So rook to d8 was played. Rook to e7. Knight to c4. Again, I'm lost. Not really any huge purpose behind any of these moves. Rook to d4. Knight to e5. Because, well, there's actually some issues now with rook f7 check and winning the f4 pawn. So I played knight to e5 to prevent knight f7. Rook takes b7 now. Knight takes f3, getting a pawn. But after rook f7 check, king e6, rook d takes f4. Knight takes h4. Of course, they cannot take it because I can take on f7 here. But if they wanted to, they could just give a check. I move and then take the knight. They ended up just playing rook 4 f6 instead because it's actually just a mate. Because after king e5, they played rook e7 checkmate. So this was an interesting game. The big thing to discuss here, there was a few actually. So going back, this bishop to f5 is not something that I kind of like. I think bishop h5 is generally preferred, or even just taking the knight at that point. Generally, I don't like to take pieces. I like to keep tension when I can. But bishop to f5, where after, for example, just takes and takes, this position can get easily uncomfortable for black after a move like c4, where white has a lot of central control. Again, this knight c6 as well. If c4 is played, we can maybe consider c6, but even still would be bad because if takes and pawn takes, then we have an isolated pawn on d5 as well. Then also after knight takes, and knight d7, this was another big issue because we should have found either knight e4, which would go into like a symmetrical pawn structure kind of like this, which would have totally been fine for us. Or after this, bishop takes d3, which I think is best by far. And the whole point is, again, if you have to take on d3, for example, after knight d7, this position's not as bad as if this pawn were here. Even though it controls more of the center, there are more weaknesses in black's position. So knight d7 was kind of a misstep here. Bishop takes f5, e takes f5, knight to f3, and yeah, knight c5 would have been preferred instead of knight b6. But that's not super important. The next important thing, I think, is playing g6. I think g6 is a strict waste of time. I think developing the bishop instead to e7 would have been better. And because of that, we ran into issues. So next time, Braden, play bishop e7. You know, try to develop your pieces instead of creating more dark square weaknesses in the position, and then you might be fine. So that is game number 3. I am 1.5 out of 3 in this tournament so far, and I will see you guys next Wednesday with my next game in the tournament. So thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you then. Bye bye.